Right. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you guys for attending my talk this afternoon. Uh, if you're in this room, you are going to be spending the next 30 minutes with me as we do a crash course on the NIST AI RMF, or NIST AI Risk Management Framework. So before we dive into the topic, I want to give you guys a little bit of background about myself. I'm a cybersecurity advisor for Dell Technologies, particularly working within the federal business unit. In addition to working at Dell, I have the honor and privilege to be the chapter secretary for the North Alabama chapter of the Information Security Systems Association, based out of Huntsville, Alabama. And this is one of my favorite talks to do, but I have to share because I've spoken at several other B-sides and I've shared this, but one of my other presentations I've spoken across the Southeast US about the gamification of cybersecurity training and tabletop exercises using Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games. So if you're a D&D nerd in the room and afterwards, if you're looking for conversation, just feel free to come up and talk anything about that. Previous to coming to Dell, I spent the past few years of my career working in the managed services space, where I got to get experience serving clients at the micro level, where we had 5 to 10 laptops, all the way up to what I'm doing now at the enterprise level, where we're dealing with thousands and hundreds of thousands of assets all across the world. So, I want to go ahead and start off the AI RMF crash course by giving you guys a bit of background information. By show of hands, how many of you guys are familiar with the AI risk management framework? Okay, a couple of you. For how many of you is the first time you've heard of this standard or resource, either in this presentation or because of this conference? Okay, good set of hands. So I'm going to dive into some content, but I want to go ahead and give you guys some comfort. If you came into this room and you are clueless about the AI RMF, or if you mention a NIST standard, you rear up like a scared black cat, or it just spooks you out. The goal is this is going to be very simplified and in plain human English. We're going to try to tackle this topic in a way that doesn't scare you and hopefully gives you the strength and confidence afterwards to go and dive into this topic on your own. So, NIST established the Trustworthy and Responsible AI Center in March of 2023. Earlier in the year, NIST released the first kind of iteration of the AI RMF on January 26th, along with another resource. So they released the AI RMF document, which is somewhere between 40 to 60 pages, and it goes control by control. And then they released the AI RMF playbook, which is more of an interactive website where you can look at it and you get more detailed guidance control by control. This creation of those standards was in response to some proactive, I know the government mentioned proactive, it's a bit of an oxymoron, but some attempted proactiveness on the course of between really the tail end of the Trump administration and the start of the Biden administration, where you had the National AI Initiative Act of 2020, you had the National Security Commission's recommendations when it came to artificial intelligence, then you had an executive order 13859. So these were the start of, hey, we realize artificial intelligence as a technology, as a capability, is starting to evolve. And it was at the time, and even now to a certain extent still, is a bit of a Pandora's box, where depending on the context you live and thrive in, AI has a very different meaning. So one of the first iterations of this talk, I asked people what they thought of when they thought of AI and what came to mind. And if I were to ask this question to my dad about artificial intelligence, he'd think of Kit from the show Mac that he grew up with. If I were to ask some of my friends that grew up playing on the Xbox 360, you mentioned artificial intelligence, they think of Cortana, the AI from the game who later became the security board at our side on Windows 10 and 11. For me, I've always been an anime nerd, so I thought of something from Gundam Wing on Toonami with these mechs that can move on their own and were receiving commands and had intelligence to make command and destroy decisions in the field. So, that's just within immediate hearing. We talk about AI, you get a ton of different answers. If you go Google AI, what people think of it ranges everything from, oh, hey, ChatGPT can help me, tweak my writing, or in academia might help me, take these away out on paper, all the way to guys who are creating Skynet. The Terminators are coming. And the reality is those are two extremes. And most of society was somewhere in the middle between them. So that really started to come to life, I would say early this year was when we started to see ChatGPT and OpenAI and a bunch of buzz started to come out about what artificial intelligence is and what it does. So on March 28th, fun fact, I was doing this exact presentation at B-Sides Huntsville, and OMB released this memo 6 hours before I got on stage, and I did not know it. So, you know, for those that might be watching a recording, this I had to correct myself, but OMB released this memo, and it was titled Advancing Governance, Innovation, and Risk Management for Agency Use of Artificial Intelligence. And this dictated to, across the entire federal space, to every federal agency, hey, if you want to take advantage of AI capabilities, here are some actions that you need to take. And the key requirements that we pull out of that were, hey, if you're going to use AI in the federal government, we need to be able to properly maintain security governance on that solution. We can't introduce it into our environment, let it run wild. But it also was meant to be set up that, hey, once we've established proper security controls and safeguards, we absolutely can allow our federal agencies to innovate using AI to help optimize. You know, this morning, some of our speakers touched on some use cases that can happen with AI, particularly Mr. Schneier, I think I'm pronouncing that right. And then talks about that the two biggest one was, hey, we need to make sure that whatever risk comes into our environment from use of these AI systems, if we are using an AI solution that's provided by a third party, we need to make sure that there's not any risk of that data getting exfiltrated. And one of the biggest takeaways was, hey, we need to make these capabilities available to the end user. Well, so what that meant to me as a security professional, you know, in my career, I'd always been taught, if it's a capability that we don't know until we understand it, disable it, shoot it. You know, nuke it from high orbit if you have to. This memo tells us that to poor federal cyber consultants like myself, that federal agencies likely are not going to just disable or not allow AI. It is going to be a continuous push as the technology evolves. So, NIST released this guidance in an attempt to help both the federal and private sector begin to navigate how we implement security governance around artificial intelligence. So what we have on screen here is a control from the NIST AI RMF document. Remember, this is a 40 to 60 some odd page document. So Govern 2, it tells us, hey, you need to implement accountability structure, or accountability structures are in place so that appropriate teams are empowered, responsible, and trained for mapping, measuring, and managing AI risk. I don't know about you guys, that statement doesn't tell me jack squat on what to do. So, and again, Govern 2.1, 2.3, or 2.2 and 2.3 dive into that, but it's like, hey, roles and responsibilities and lines of communication relating to mapping, measuring, and managing AI risk are documented and are clear to individuals and teams throughout the organization. Well, that's a good idea. But again, if we're looking at just this document, there's nothing actionable, or it's a little vague. We don't quite know what to do with it. So that's where, if you're wanting to use the AI RMF, you have to use this in conjunction with the playbook. And note, you do not have to read the eye chart there. The slides have been uploaded to the SOS Fusion 24 website. You have ability to access this. All the links are embedded. So what we get here in the AI RMF playbook is we get a lot more guidance for each of these controls that are actually actionable. You know, so for Govern 2, you want to know what the suggestion action is? It says, hey, we need to establish policies that define the various roles of people involved. And I don't know if anyone else in the room is a NIST 800-171 or a CMMC nerd, but using that language, what this is looking for is that we've got policy and procedure documented. And also for being able to monitor that risk, it's looking for a racing, or a matrix that shows who's responsible, who's accountable, who in our organization do we consult when we have a problem, and who do we inform of the outcomes. But also alongside that, NIST breaks out a bit of a model for how we need to look at life cycle stages. So what this chart, again, another eye chart, I apologize. But what this is looking at is kind of from cradle to grave, how do we develop and use an AI capability? So we start off with the plan and design phase, and it lists out the appropriate stakeholders, but then it ends at the, hey, after we've done our development, we've done our testing, the core concern of any AI tool is how does this impact the people that are using it? What does this do to the human beings behind the screen? How does this impact others around? And then we look at the environmental impact, trying to balance in two hands kind of awkwardly, that balance between technological innovation and being able to push the envelope forward and making sure that we have the resources to sustain it. As I don't know who else in here has done a lot with any development or implementing hardware for AI, but man, the amount of processing there consumes a lot of power. And there are even recently, as in a couple of weeks ago, there are cases where you have Facebook and other companies are either being sued or suing because they don't have the appropriate power to power the hardware. So, and again, a lot of what we see in the AI actors across life cycle stages, once you look at the chart, it makes a little more sense. But this is also designed, if we put it like this makes a little more sense. Because if you look at it as a linear chart, anyone that develops a tool, in most cases, isn't just going to develop a tool or capability and let it sit on the shelf. I have a couple of friends of mine that are software developers that I know they've been working on the same projects for 5-6 years, and they keep going back to it to improve and to update what they're posting out on GitHub. And I'll tell you, that is a passion and drive that I admire, and it challenges me. So when NIST designed this, they kind of looked at the programmer and designer in everyone that's going to be designing this, and they set this up to be a cycle. That, okay, when we start and plan and design a solution, we're going to then walk through that life cycle, and then we get into kind of the operate and monitor at the end where, hey, we are using the solution, the end user using it, it is happy, but then it has the room to go back into the plan and design phase. That, hey, we've got more data available for us to ingest into the model, for the model to use so we can attempt to improve the user outputs. Or, hey, we found our model is, kind of poking fun a little bit playfully at what we saw with Google Gemini, where if you were to go to Gemini when it first launched, if you're like, hey, give me a recipe for how to make a pizza, it would throw in Elmer's glue or cardboard paste or random nonsense into it. Now, granted, to Google's credit, they fixed that rather quickly, but it allows for this cyclical approach allows us to continuously monitor and improve and better the solutions before. And from a security perspective, this also allows us to be engaged to where security is not just engaging, towards the tail end after the solution's been built and security is coming in and going, yeah, we can't do this, this, and this. The way the AI RMF is, it calls out specifically in the playbook that we're engaging all appropriate stakeholders within an organization. That you have, okay, the designers, the developers, that they are interfacing with GRC, with your compliance team. And your compliance team's interfacing with the IT department. They're interfacing with security and appropriate stakeholders so that we make sure that as these solutions get implemented, we're doing this right from the get-go. And it's not causing that, cultural back and forth where security says no, the developers have to go back and fix. They bring it back and security still says no. And then you have this awkward tension. And honestly, a ton of paperwork that doesn't need to be involved. So the NIST AI RMF also, again, I realize this might be boring, so I'm going to try to make this less boring, but it calls in a lot of structure for, hey, here are the characteristics that we need to bear in mind when developing an AI system. And it calls out a ton of qualities, and I'll tell you, there is not a ton of depth to NIST guidance here. I don't know about anyone else. I assume that the authors may have presumed that, okay, you've taken an ethics class at some point, whether in school, high school, or in college, or whatever. And again,
They talk about safe. Hey, we don't need to be, like the use case that was described, you shouldn't be able to go into ChatGPT and ask it, how can I build a bomb? And then it gives you the proper listing of materials and ratios and et cetera. By the other proxy, you shouldn't be able to exfiltrate data from an AI tool that's being used. Secure and resilient, this is looking at a solution that, hey, this solution is as safe as we can make it. And if someone tries to attack that tool directly via a code injection or trying to insert some bad data into the LLM, that we're able to withstand attack. Explainable and interpretable is the one that I found most interesting, because it requires that if there is any sort of logic tracing, that if you have to work backwards from the result an AI tool generates and go back and figure out what you're doing, that it needs to be understandable in plain English. We need to be able to lay it out in a format that someone who's maybe not a technologist or may not be a SME in the particular tool or application, that they can look at it and understand. Privacy enhanced is very much ensuring that, hey, we are not ingesting any PII, PHI, or any sensitive data into it. And on the off chance that data winds up in our solution, that it isn't exfiltrated. That we are operating with controlling what we can at the front end to make sure that that data is not getting in. But God forbid it does, we need to make sure it can't be exfiltrated out. Fair with harmful bias managed is where, as we're training that model, that it's able to have appropriate bias based off the data to make the decisions. I think of a security operations center with this, where, okay, they're analyzing a ton of network traffic coming in and out of that environment to where it's able to make the decision, but it's not making a decision to the excess that it harms another human being or causes it to make a decision that is demeaning in some way, shape, or form. And that's all those characteristics are laid over top of valid and reliable. The system needs to provide accurate outputs, and we need to be able to lean on it. So the control structure is built around 4 things. Govern is kind of at the center. That deals with how we administer just general security governance over the environment. This also calls in IT governance, so I need to correct myself and just say governance, period. And then around it, we've got the map, measure, and manage. So if you're familiar with the risk management framework, this is going to sound very, very familiar. So for the govern portion, we're looking at 6 categories with 19 subcategories. Effectively, based on how the document's structured, I would take each subcategory and map it as a control. If you're looking at it from an 853 or 800-171 or a CIS control perspective. So govern's going to look a lot at how AI is managed within the environment. What are the safeguards we're placing around it? How are we informing the end user on what they can and cannot do using the tool? If you're wanting to kind of map this into another framework, this shares a lot of similarities to what you see in RMF within the risk assessment, supply chain risk assessment, or supply chain risk management, correction, I'm getting my frameworks flipped, and the systems and services acquisition domain in NIST 853. This is where you lean a lot on writing policies that tell the users what they can and cannot do. And then we've got technical procedures that are well documented and maintained for how we update and manage the tool itself. So that way, with those proper safeguards in place, we can then implement accountability for if something fails, or we can correct if things break. The map domain, by the similar logic I just laid out, it's about 18 controls. This is where you are categorizing the system, and you're really doing kind of an ad hoc risk analysis of what do we gain from using this tool or developing this tool, and what are the drawbacks of it. If you're familiar with any compliance framework, scoping is your enemy and also your best friend for determining your boundary. What you're doing in the map domain is effectively a lot of risk assessment, and you're laying out the scope for where that tool can and cannot touch. This is where, again, we're trying to overlay, we're shifting from what is the AI tool doing to, hey, how does this fit into our broader environment? Think of it alongside, how IT administrators had to adapt for their DLP, data loss prevention tools, whenever Microsoft Copilot started to come about, where Copilot allows you to upload documents to it and get feedback, and then it can automatically tweak those changes. But if you have something that might be proprietary to an organization or a little more sensitive, you don't want to throw it into Microsoft's tool. The measure domain, even though I just used the term risk assessment, what differentiates this is in this domain, effectively 22 controls that focus a lot on risk, on what are the actual things that could happen if this goes wrong, what's the impact of the organization to the end user, and we also apply metrics. What is the money that could be lost to the business if this tool goes haywire? What does it cost us to run and support this tool and all the different things that go alongside that? This is where when I talked about the qualifications of a system, those ethical standards, that they are assessed, and they're assessed here. And then lastly, this brings us to manage, where we have 13 controls, and this is where you really bring those other domains, and you begin to coalesce that data. You coalesce the outcomes and the goals, and you begin to actually keep track of, hey, here's what we're doing to keep the system up and running. Here's what we're doing to address some of the risks. Here's what we're doing to potentially identify future risk. While the AI RMF does not call this out, this is where effectively, if you're familiar with what a system security plan or an SSP or a POAM, a plan of actions and milestones, this is effectively, those two things would be the best way to begin to approach these controls, in my opinion. So the managed domain is all about, this is where action gets taken. So looking at the broader framework, it's very loose and flexible. To where if you look at this from a control by control perspective, it doesn't give you prescriptive guidance. So this shares a lot of similarities with the NIST cybersecurity framework, where you have a little bit of a pick your own adventure book of security controls, where you can take some controls, you can leave some controls, but the controls that you choose to implement, you have to make sure that you're actually implementing them. And again, this is the first step. And I would say, again, for just kind of looking in terms of timeline, that AI really began to kind of be a buzzworthy topic towards the end of last year, started this year, and then not even 3 months later, NIST has already gotten some guidance published that businesses can use. And it's my opinion that the guidance and documentation is only going to get better from here, as particularly the frameworks adopted within the open source security community and as it's adopted within the private sector. Particularly as you see as the federal government continues to begin pushing for this. So I believe that brings me nearly to time, but I have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions if there are any. I want to be mindful of the next presenter's time. Any questions? Yes.
With the cybersecurity framework, which are 2, 3 playbooks. You speculate on similar things for AI and finance.
So I would speculate that that's likely down the road. They also took with how they structured those playbooks, and I forgot to mention it earlier, but how they structured the playbooks is very similar to how the CSF does theirs. So there's very similar structure at the base level for it that I think honestly will just improve. What I would hopefully like to see is, as this gets adopted and a little further spun along, would be some sort of overlay from the federal government where we can see how we can integrate this into other compliance frameworks, particularly 53 and 171. But if we don't get that from the federal government, I anticipate there are a couple open source groups that are probably already on that. So, all right. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys for your time and attending. I'll be around afterwards if you all have questions.